November 13, 1985, one of Colombia's tallest volcanoes erupted. Nevado Del Ruiz is located above the subduction zone of the Nazca and South American plates. The denser oceanic Nazca Plate subducts under the South American continental plate. The rising magma from the partial melting of the oceanic crust makes its way through the continental crust, and an eruption is caused. Nevado del Ruiz is 5,389 metres tall, and although it is only 500 kilometres from the equator, it has a 30-metre thick sheet of ice on top of it. The eruption was not the only hazard here. The hot pyroclastic material melted the ice sheet on top of the volcano, causing lahars. The lahar rushed down the volcano at around 45 kilometres an hour. Along the way, it picked up loose debris and soil, carrying this material towards the town of Armero. The town of Armero was mostly destroyed. Over 23,000 people are known to have died, and approximately 5,000 were injured. It is the deadliest known lahar and Colombia's worst natural disaster.
The start of the continuous infrequent activity started here when the Arenas crater erupted. As a result of the 1984 eruption, seismographs were installed around the volcano. This small eruption lasted 6 hours, and lithic ash was deposited. The government dismissed this report, and authorities didn't want to evacuate people until they were assured of the necessity. The Armero tragedy is one of the most controversial disasters in recent history. Wisner et al. Defined vulnerability as the diminished capacity of an individual or group to anticipate, cope with, or resist and recover from the impact of a hazard. The extent to which a subject is vulnerable depends on physical, social, economic and environmental factors which, when coupled with a hazard, can put the subject at risk of disaster. In the years preceding the 1985 eruption, the Colombian government failed to recognise Armero's vulnerabilities. Nevado del Ruiz is part of the Andes and is the highest mountain in Colombia. At 5,389 metres tall, it had an ice cap and was often masked in cloud. As a stratovolcano, it is prone to pyroclastic flow, which aids the formation of mud flows. It was therefore a likely route for liquid hazards in the future. Though Armero was the third largest town in the Tolima department at the time, it had limited transport routes and building codes. Though it was well known that Nevado had a history of serious volcanic hazards, its change in activities were not viewed as a serious threat by the Colombian government. The government itself had limited resources for monitoring the volcano. As an LEDC, all equipment had to be outsourced, and no local geologist had the training to use any information produced. Armero also had social vulnerabilities. A government-produced hazard map highlighted areas most at risk should an eruption occur. The map itself, however, was minimal and flawed due to budget limitations and the reluctance of the officials. Only 10 copies were ever produced. Some local newspapers tried to reproduce their own, but without the proper equipment or training, they were inaccurate and unreliable. Officials tried to minimise undue worry and therefore did not raise awareness or encourage preparation. Education about volcanic hazards was not part of the curriculum, and despite ongoing advice from the UN and NGOs, the government continued disregarding Nevado as a sleeping lion, the nickname amongst locals. As an LEDC, Colombia was dependent on low-quality technology, particularly radios. Officials, priests and broadcasters quickly conveyed messages to the whole community, as many residents had one. Catholic priests held a significant role in society, as they were often more trusted and respected by locals and politicians. Political instability can increase vulnerability, and at the time of the Armero tragedy, guerrilla warfare in the capital, 169 miles away, was at its peak. This seemed a more pressing threat to the Colombian government than a potential eruption from Nevado. Therefore, despite pleas for help from local officials, Armero was overlooked. At the time, Armero is one of the most successful farming towns in Colombia, responsible for 1/5 of the country's rice production and a significant contributor to cotton, sorghum and coffee production. This was because the town was built on the debris from Nevado's last eruption, therefore the ground was very fertile. As a small town 169 kilometres away from the capital in an LEDC, Armero did not have excessive wealth to lose, but the eruption had the potential to become bankrupt, as almost all livelihoods would be lost. The environmental loss that Armero faced was the desolation of the landscape around it. Lahars and mudflows could wipe out agricultural land and carry debris such as plants and rubble from the volcano's sides as it flowed. This would increase the likelihood of flooding in the future, and rubble embedded in the soil could seriously disrupt farming activities. The accumulation of all these factors meant that Armero was left highly vulnerable and unable to cope with Nevado del Ruiz eruption on 13th of November 1985. To this day, many people believe that the government held responsibility. The start of the devastating eruption had begun, unknown to the residents of Armero. Intense rainfall was observed in Armero, a town 40 miles away from the volcano. Pyroclastic flows and surges have emitted from the vent. Rain saturated the ash fallen over Armero, changing its composition when making landfall. 6 minutes later, Armero was up to 6 metres deep in mud and intense sulphur dioxide was emitted into the air. Relief activities were made by the Red Cross and the Colombian Civil Defence Team. 2 weeks after the disaster, there was a task to create and design a recovery initiative to provide housing, employment and food. 2,000 people lived in refugee camps. In the tents, there were around 3 to 4 people, but there was much conflict as people wanted to cook for themselves and did not want to be served. There was occupational training in the camps in sewing, baking and carpentry. The people in the refugee camps were very low-income groups. They suffered low education levels, lack of economic skills and poverty prior to the disaster. This would explain their lack of knowledge on volcanic activity and the fact that they did not spot any warning signs. Houses were being built quickly to save time and get people out of the camps. They said they would add private bathrooms at a later date. This technique was not something long-term because if the volcanoes to erupt again, history would repeat itself. One of the biggest problems as a result of the eruption was the water supply because pipelines were damaged and the water was dangerous to drink because it had temporary acidity in it. Therefore, portable water purification systems had been sent, but the people in the refugee camps were not happy because they claimed that it was not enough. Mass vaccination campaigns began across the area in Colombia after a scare of a potential cholera epidemic. Even though it turned out not to be true, this does present an effective response that Colombia did attempt to mitigate against a possible secondary impact. 1,000 herd of cattle were lost, with another 35,000 cattle experiencing weight loss from the lack of food, which resulted in a decreased milk production. This is a crucial economic advantage for Colombia, as the money could have been used to rebuild the country. There were many faults in the management of the disaster of Nevado Del Ruiz. Earthquakes were happening 51 weeks prior to the eruption. It made people nervous, but not enough that they thought it was a threat. If they had acted sooner, the catastrophe may not have been so bad. They did not have the equipment to monitor the volcano and did not have the geologists which knew how to work it. All of this started to be sent after the disaster had happened, so it took a disaster for them to realise what to do. Finally, only 10 copies of the HAZMAT map were distributed and did not give an evacuation to the public.
There was concern about the possible threats to the emergency operations from the guerrilla groups active in the Colombian countryside, causing the initial operations to be delayed whilst the situation was assessed. To evacuate before the event, especially for an indefinite period, would have caused enormous problems, political and economic risks for a financially strapped government in providing the funding for facilities and resources needed to support a mobile community. Security against looting in evacuated areas and even the possibilities of guerrillas taking advantage of crisis conditions could not be overlooked. Thus, the authorities were unwilling to bear the economic or political costs of early evacuation or a false alarm. Preliminary evacuation plans for Armero were drawn up by the local emergency committee, but not many individuals had yet seen them. Employment income in the affected regions, as a result of the disruption of the major economic activities and the destruction of many industrial and commercial enterprises, lowered drastically. Tickets for Colombian National Championship soccer games added a surcharge of 5 cents to go to relief efforts. Approximately 50 school facilities as well as many experienced teachers and administrators were lost, vastly reducing the amount of people who could continue educating afterwards. The influx of refugees from Armero in some of the nearby towns was perceived as disruptive and undesirable by the locals, causing conflicts to arise. Virtually everyone in the valley knew someone who had died in Armero, and many had lost relatives. In addition, many survivors had sustained handicapping injuries, others had lost their employment or property. Refugee families from Armero could expect to spend months in temporary shelter, with little prospect of returning to their former community. Sadness and depression over the loss of so many relatives and friends seemed likely to persist for a long time, with these emotions typically being heightened around the time of traditional celebrations. The mud flows affected many square kilometres, so survivors were scattered over a wide area and mobility in the valley was hampered by the impassable mud deposits. Aircrafts and helicopters thus became the main method of search and rescue. A major logistical problem in the first few hours concerned the requisitioning, fueling and use of helicopters to rescue survivors trapped in or near the mudflow and to carry those needing urgent emergency medical care to the designated sites. Recognising the need for a second line of defence to ensure that no lethal mudflow could occur without public alert, Risk Chief Pablo Medina in December and January tried to gain USGS OFDA approval for a critically located 7-station Lahar warning network with satellite telemetry, technology that had been demonstrated at Mount St. Helens. However, the USGS included overhead and placed the cost at $290,000 on the project. The proposal was rejected by the OFDA on the grounds of cost and technical complexity. 6,000 acres of grain and other crops, as well as many livestock, portions of the agricultural infrastructure, and much prime farmland was lost, causing local food shortages and loss of livelihood. The contamination of the river had greatly affected the local fishing industries. In early 1986, data regarding the happenings of the volcano indicates strongly of an eruption in the near future, with a mortality rate estimate of 50 to 80,000 people. The Columbia Emergency Warning and Evacuation Plan was created in response to a potential future eruption. If there was any alarming activity, the President of Columbia would be notified by someone from the Volcanic Observatory overlooking the volcano. The President would then coordinate with the National Emergency Committee, who would then involve the Colombian Civil Defense. The Civil Defense would notify the Governor, who would then go on to inform the mayors of at-risk towns. The police department would be informed by their various mayors, and they would go on to notify each town siren keeper, who would finally convey the threat of imminent danger to the people. There are also volunteers in place who watch the rivers between various towns and the volcano to detect any lahars. Officials who use tools such as teletype machines, telephone links, and two-way radios to communicate in order to prepare for and respond to an eruption. In regards to educating the public, firstly, from early 1986, children in schools were educated on what to do in response to a volcanic eruption and other volcanic hazards. Secondly, the Red Cross and Civil Defense printed and distributed various flyers warning people to evacuate the town as soon as the siren started. Thirdly, in poster form, hazard maps were circulated around the town advising people of the action they needed to take once the sirens had started. A 4-person study team was sent by the National Research Council to Columbia between the 9th and 14th of February 1986, and while there they found 2 potential flaws when it came to the early warning and evacuation system. Firstly, 3 hours was the length of time it took for the warning message to reach the public, whereas some towns could have been affected by the eruption in as little as 30 to 45 minutes and others in just 2.5 hours. Secondly, despite extensive evidence saying that sirens alone are not enough to motivate people to evacuate from their place of residence, sirens represent the main component of the evacuation plan. The study team went on to create a report detailing recommendations of how the early warning system can be improved. 2 of the recommendations were additional monitoring equipment should be installed for mud flows, and evacuation warnings should be delivered verbally to the public. As a result, the warning would carry a more urgent tone and should snap people into action.
This newspaper article was released just weeks after the eruption, explaining that a lack of equipment was the cause of so many deaths, therefore highlighting underlying issues in the country. A detailed film was made about the eruption and the terror it caused. Should this have been made was questioned. Whether procedures thinking about the effect it had on the survivors, volcanologists really thought about. A volcanologist, Bernard Shout, examined the data from Ruiz and found a pattern of events that could have indicated an eruption. If only someone could have understood this, the lives of 20,000 people could have been saved.
On record for the past 4 years, there has been a fluctuation in the level of activity by the Nevado Del Ruiz volcano. This includes small seismic activity due to new magma rising into the volcano, gas plumes being produced, a weak incandescence emanating from the volcano, and sulfur and ash cloud emissions. 2 key events would be Wednesday the 30th of May 2012, the volcano's official status was increased to orange, which means that eruption was likely to occur within weeks, due to small explosive eruptions on the 29th of May. Due to ash emissions, airports were closed in 3 towns and 500 people who lived nearest to the volcano were evacuated. Dust masks were also being distributed to the public by authorities. Sunday the 24th of May 2015, due to continuing ash emissions, which had been a few hundred meters in height from the volcano at uneven interval, Manizales Airport was closed by authorities.